Okay, let's start with the rotary locking system. So let me phrase the question something to the effect, when you did both the M16, AR-15, and the Stoner 63 system, you used the forward locking rotary bolt type mechanism. What other weapons have you used that type of locking system in the course of your career?
Well, the largest caliber was the 25 millimeter automatic cannon I did for TRW, called the Bushmaster or the 6425 model. And the reason I picked it in the larger caliber was the fact that that was a fairly low speed, low velocity type system as far as the bolt group is concerned. That system has the advantages of being very lightweight, overall weight in the weapon, easy to produce, extremely strong as far as its weight's concerned. But the disadvantage is it isn't applicable to what I'd call a very high-speed bolt system, where you're trying to get the absolute maximum velocity out of the moving parts to get the rate of fire up. So it was picked in the 6425 because that weapon was only going to fire 550 rounds a minute. And if you went to other types of locks, you could run that up over 1,000. But say it was never intended for a high-speed operation.
We hear various comments about cyclic rates on weapons. This one has a cyclic rate of 850, another one may have 450, 550. With the Gatling type guns, they've gotten up to several thousand rounds a minute. How does the application affect the cyclic rate that you go after, and sort of following on to that, how's the cyclic rate then affect the design?
Well, the cyclic rate, it affects the design. I mean, that's one of the first considerations on a machine gun, is what cyclic rate is required, and that's basically how it's going to be used by the user. For instance, the higher cyclic rates are needed for air-to-air type weapons, and to get the hit probabilities up. And the next ones would be the anti-aircraft type weapons, would have to have a high cyclic rate in order to hit anything. They have to have a high volume of fire. Then other applications, like on vehicle weapons or anti-personnel weapons, usually the cyclic rates are more desirable to be lower than they are high, because mainly the tactical use of them. You don't need the tremendously high volume of fire to have an effect on the targets. For instance, against people, keeping them in place, keeping their heads down. You can do just about as good a job with a weapon that's firing 500 or 600 rounds a minute than you can as one that's firing 5,000 or 6,000 rounds a minute. And you certainly have an ammunition supply that'll last twice as long or 3 times as long. But the cyclic rate does determine very definitely the type of mechanism. In case of the Gatling gun, you've got a multiple of guns that are all working in unison, which, in other words, 6 barrels and 6 bolt mechanisms, and like building 6 different weapons, tying them all together. In a single barrel system, such as that 6425, or in the case of the 35 millimeter Talon gun, the cyclic rate and also the ultimate design characteristics, vary quite a bit. We'll get into it probably a little later. Like the Talon gun, you'll see we went into a completely different bolt mechanism that can operate at a much higher velocity. I don't know if that explains everything or not, but
let's pursue it a little. Okay.
Okay.
With the 6425, why did you settle on 550 rounds a minute?
The 550 was the desirable amount because it was the first entry of the U.S. requirement into a cannon size weapon for vehicle mounting, which had habitually been 50 caliber was about as large as they ever went. And they wanted to keep the cyclic rate as low as possible, mainly for conservation of ammunition because of the volume it took and the weight and everything inside the vehicle. So they wanted a smaller weapon that would defeat the target plus the fact they wanted to conserve ammunition and and keep the rate down to do that. And at that point in time, the rate of fire that was chosen, which was 550 rounds a minute, was based on previous experience of self-protection against low-performance aircraft. In other words, where you were the target, the airplane that was attacking was coming directly at you, and they felt that the 550 rounds a minute, which was actually derived around the experience of using the 50 caliber Browning machine gun, was as low as they wanted to go. But on the other hand, they didn't want to go any higher because it would be ammunition conservation problem.
What happens when you go from a weapon which is essentially 50 caliber, 12.7 millimeter, to one that's 1 inch or 25 millimeter? What kind of design changes, what kind of design problems do you run into when you make that jump?
Well, what you're trying to do, I think, mainly is to, the laws of physics start to prevail a little, and a little more difficulty comes up. It's like the elephant and the ant routine, you know, the ant can lift up another ant very easily because of its mass and so forth, but, you know, it's difficult when you get up into elephant sizes. And the same thing as an effect in the gun mechanisms, where as you start scaling up, the weight of the parts and the mass of the parts start influencing the design in a lot greater detail than what the small caliber weapon, and mainly impact loads and accelerations and velocities and distances that you're having to travel. You really start taxing a lot of the elements that in large caliber that really aren't important in smaller caliber. For instance, even in springs and spring designs, especially driving springs, you run into inertia problems within the spring masses themselves that you can completely ignore in the smaller caliber weapons. So it becomes a really, starting at approximately 20 millimeter on up, you can get into almost a different set of rules than you would from 20 millimeter on down. And especially, it kind of coincidentally, in those cases, most people in the later trends anyway, have been to get the highest rate possible out of them. The exception being this 6425, which is now, or the Bushmaster, which is now 25 years old. The modern trend, I'm sure, if they had that to do over again, you'd find the rate of fire probably higher, because the importance of targets now have shifted more from ground targets to aircraft type targets.
Can you, for a lay type person, explain sort of what goes on inside something like a 25 millimeter cannon when you, from the point where you put the cartridge into the weapon and sort of go through the cycle and explain sort of the mysteries of what are going on inside there?
The mysteries?
Well, or what is actually happening. You know, a lot of people have never looked inside an automatic weapon.
That's something that's hard to describe. I think you'd almost have to do that graphically to show what it is. But it's mainly, you know, the cyclic functions are generally the loading of the weapon, locking the system up so that the high pressure gases are contained, and then extracting the empty cartridge case and ejecting it out of the weapon, and then reloading. I mean, those are the basic cycles, and all systems about are similar. I think some of the exceptions are the new types of telescoped round ammunitions use little different principles of doing that than what you're normally used to. But I think you really have to kind of graphically show those
we might
functions.
be able to show that when we get down with the Talon. After you did the 6425, and I guess that got its designation from the fact that the design was begun in 64 and it was 25 millimeter. Is
that is the clue, yes.
Okay, that's okay, all right. When did Aries come into existence? I know it came into existence after TRW closed up the weapons shop, but you know, what was the date on that? I guess we need to wait for somebody to.
That's okay now.
How old are we now?
So you were incorporated in 72.
Okay, 1972. And that was shortly after, within a year after, I believe, that TRW closed down their ordnance research group.
And for the record, where is Aries, and how did it get to be where it is, I guess?
Well, Aries is located in the old Erie Proving Grounds, which is on Lake Erie, close to Port Clinton, Ohio. And it's a historical site now, by the way, because it was a proving grounds that was started in the First World War in about 1917 or in that time frame. And the thing kept in operation up until just a few years ago, probably in about 1970, late 60s or in that time frame. It got closed down, and it was kind of a pity that it did, because it was the closest proving grounds to the tank arsenal and all the activities going on in Detroit. And there were various rumors why it was closed down. One, it was too cheap to operate in comparison to Aberdeen and so forth, that it always looked bad, and they decided they were just going to get rid of it. So it had a lot of facilities like these buildings that we're in and so forth here, and the actual firing ranges weren't really good for much anything else, and so we were lucky to be able to, lease these grounds. And this allows us to fire. We have impact areas we share with the National Guard of Ohio, and it allows us to fire several miles out in the lake with larger caliber guns. We can also fire anti-aircraft guns up to, I believe, 23,000 feet. What's rather unique, and we've been able to preserve this area mainly because the National Guard has an interest in it. I think if we were a private company, there'd be no chance in the world that we could survive and keep this thing as a restricted area.
Well, in an age when we have so few live fire ranges in the U.S., that despite all the space we have, it really is a unique resource in that sense.
Yes.
When Aries got a start in the early 70s, I guess the first project that you, one of the first projects you worked on for the Army was the future assault rifle concept. And for me, that's one of those great mystery projects. I don't know that much about it, so if you could maybe just say a few minutes of what the goals were on that, then we can get down to some of the more contemporary things.
I think the first project we had was really that externally powered machine gun. And we didn't really have even any facility for contracting at the time. We were so small, so I went to my friends at Cadillac Gauge, and they actually did the paperwork and so forth to do that. We did the work. And then after that, we did get this contract on the future assault rifle, and that was really sponsored by DARPA. And what it was taking ideas that I had and trying to consolidate them into a group of ideas into a future rifle. And it was an opportunity to try out a whole bunch of things, from the sighting system, which was a little reflex sight that had a lot of promise to it, and this was a good opportunity to try it out. It had a special magazine system that allowed you to preload magazines and then energize a spring in the field so that you could store the ammunition indefinitely in the magazines. It had a muzzle brake compensator system that was really borrowed right off the old AR-10, but for the smaller caliber weapon. It had a buffer system that had a complete energy absorption, so that it kept the rate of fire down, but also gave you a considerable amount of bolt energy without, increasing the rate of fire. So it was quite a few combinations of things like that, and actually it was a very successful program. But due to the fact that it was a DARPA-sponsored program, the Army gave us the courtesy of testing it, and commended very highly on it, but said, so what? We don't really have a requirement for a new weapon. But it turned out to be a very exceptionally reliable weapon, and it also very, very low dispersion on automatic fire with a muzzle brake compensator and so forth on it. But there was never any follow-up on it, even though it was, I thought it was, with the reports and all, it was a very, very successful small arm. But there again, no requirement at the time.
It also came at a time when the small arms R&D program was sort of hitting rock bottom post-Vietnam. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I think it was actually the externally powered machine gun and that program were about the time that the Army was under a lot of criticism too, and this USASA group was put together. And we actually worked with them somewhat on those two programs. But yeah, it was rather rock bottom. There had been an awful lot of M16s produced, and there was no great interest in, at that time, to come up with any successor.
Okay.
I have some elementary questions to
Okay.
ask. First of all, you were asking about the history of Aries and all. What does the name stand for?
Aries is the, it isn't the zodiac sign. The way it's spelled, it's actually the Greek god of war. So we have to explain that every once in a while. And it was, and what we both, Bob and I both agreed to, that it would be just a name. It wasn't going to incorporate anything significant like people's names or anything like that. But that's really what it means.
Sort of like Exxon, just a nice sounding name. And
Yeah, but there might be a little significance with being the Greek god of war, but that would be about it.
And then the other question I had, which sort of formed listening to a lot of your answers, in terms of when you begin to design a new product, where does the inspiration for that design come from? Are you responding to an RFP? Do you sort of walk into the shop and, you know, how does that?
well, maybe we could take the LMG, because you said a little bit about that yesterday, but that might.
Well, I think that varies. Sometimes it's, for instance, somebody said, well, what we need is this better mousetrap, and what we want in it that's different from the other ones, or more producible, lighter weight, or whatever. And it could be an RFP, or it could be just, in some cases, like in some of the other weapons I've designed, it would be a, well, what do you think a future rifle or machine gun really should be? You know, I've had that left up to me once in a while, and then I kind of do my thing, survey the things, and see what I think is practical to come up with as a design to meet that particular requirement. I like those jobs better than I do responding to RFPs. Some of them are so limiting that you can't use any originality on, a la the Dover Devil, for instance. When we responded to that, all you could do in that, as you remember that program, that 50 caliber program from the Army, all you could do is copy what they'd already done, which was already a mistake, you know. So there wasn't much you could do about it. But they do vary in requirements, and even in the if you're responding to an RFP, hopefully you have quite a bit of latitude to do your own thing.
You have in front of you your new light machine gun. Can you maybe walk us through how that came into being and what kind of design goals you had in developing this thing, especially in terms of a low-risk venture of producing something fairly quickly that would meet some deficiencies, maybe not needs, but some deficiencies?
This weapon actually was kind of a quickie job, as I consider it, and like you say, I figured a fairly low-risk one, was after I'd been out of the small caliber design business for quite some time, and I was kind of intrigued with the fact of all the trouble that they were having with the 249, which was the Mini-Me 5.56 caliber machine gun, and it seemed that they were having an awful lot of difficulty over something that didn't seem quite that complicated. And I talked to several people, and they were quite concerned about whether they could really solve all the problems or not. And I got a list of the deficiencies and a report or two on it, and I kind of went down the list and figured, well, I think I can take care of this or that and so on down the line, and do it with a design that I felt that was fairly well proven. In other words, using basic parts and bits and pieces and principles off of other weapons that I already had done. So I got on the drawing board and I came up with this light machine gun, and it kind of liberally uses parts and techniques that I'd already had used and gone through before. And in some cases, actually, rather than design up a new bipod arrangement, I just use the lightweight M60 bipod. I use sights off of the 63 system that I had designed some time before. And the front locking rotary bolt was pretty much off of the M16 and 63 weapon. And generally went around and simplified things where I could. And then one other thing that I tried on this was machining out the parts rather than stamp them out using the numerical control or computer controlled machinery, which I believe fits this type of production very, very well. In other words, it's not a real high production, but a medium production. These types of machines, I think, will beat out anything else. So I tried to design the gun to take advantage of the least amount of setups and the capabilities of the computer-controlled machines. So that was the complete basic idea. I was also borrowed the pistol grip off of the M16 and a trigger guard, and
Okay, well, let's pick up going around the gun again and start with the pistol grip and winter trigger, I guess.
well, the pistol grip is the standard one off the M16 A2, and so is the trigger guard. Some of the other parts that aren't apparent here are the extractor is off of the 63 system, the driving spring assembly, which it turned out that the standard or the old standard M60 machine gun driving spring worked out just right for this thing, so we used that because it was in stock and been in production for a long time. So there are a lot of little bits and pieces like that that I used on it, just simply to say they were good enough and it worked into the design and saved a lot of time. Plus, that also means the risk was less. Some of the features that I went down to try to eliminate the deficiencies that were on the 249, and I think if I can rotate this thing around a little bit, I can show you what some of those might be. One of the biggest objections on the 249 was the fact that it didn't have a upper handguard assembly, that the shooters were always burning their hands quite severely because the barrel was exposed. So I, of course, included a handguard arrangement on it. The other thing is that the 249s had a adjustable gas port system. And my experience has been if you put an adjustment on a weapon, it's generally always set on the wrong setting. I mean, Murphy's Law prevails on that all the time. So we actually built up some models with the adjustable gas port and finally concluded that there was a real good chance we could get by with just a single gas port setting. So it eliminates any adjustment on the weapon whatsoever. The other thing is that we have the barrel change is very similar to the 63. It's just a pin arrangement and this lever that you push down, slide the barrel out. The other thing that the Army had great disagreement with FN on was the length of the buttstock. And in one case they said it was too long, and then they changed it, and then they said it was too short, and everybody got quite upset about that. So I devised this buttstock arrangement that actually could be changed in length by just pushing a button, and whatever you like or whatever turns you on, you end up with that buttstock. So that was one of the, and also you're able to shorten the system by pushing it all the way down. Also incorporated a rail sighting system up here that takes a standard mounting for various types of sights, such as night sights and infrared sights and regular optical sights for the future, because it seems like any weapon you end up with, somebody's going to change the sighting systems on it. The safety is an ambidextrous safety that's reminiscent of the old M1, reach it with any hand, either side. And that's really about the only control on the weapon. The cocking system and all that are pretty standard. The feed mechanism is unique on the gun. It's quite a bit more compact than the normal systems and quite a bit simpler.
You might also mention you just take that whole stock off
Oh yeah.
for close quarters. Okay,
Might set this thing up to where you can see a little bit easier on the bipod. So the feed system is a little unique, or I think different than anything on the market right now. The fact it's a very compact, simple system. You can see there are very few parts involved into the feed system or feed cover compared to most machine guns. And this system was derived also to make this weapon compatible to a M16 magazine. There's two ways it can be fired from the belt, as you see there, or you can use with an adapter. You can use an M16 magazine. It also has a dovetail slot under here to accept the belted ammunition box, a 200-round box that's standard in the inventory now. But if we could get the adapter, we can show the changeover, that a man could carry this little adapter in his pocket, and if he ran out of belted ammunition and had magazines from M16s from the squad around him, he can quickly change over and keep on firing with that. But I don't know exactly how far we can go until we get those parts, but basically that's one of the things that's unique on this, is this simplified feed system, as I call it.
How do the number of parts in that feed system compare to what exists in, say, the Stoner 63?
Well, it's quite a bit simpler. In the feed cover alone, it probably has about half the parts. And in a case like the 249, it'd probably be even more favorable than that in the ratio.
So that has two effects, right? It reduces cost and also eliminates things that can go wrong.
Well, that's right. Anytime you can simplify it and not reduce the number of parts, you usually reduce the number of things that go wrong. Not all the time, but this feed system too, the way it works, has one other function. It actually acts as the ejector system on the weapon. Just kind of worked out that way. But while we're waiting around for these other things, we could run through a field strip. I can also show you how simple this thing is to load in a belt of ammunition. So all you have to do is open up the feed cover and just lay around in the feed tray and shut it, and you're ready to fire. And to download the weapon when you want to download it, just open it up and you can check in the chamber. You're all safe and ready to go.
Why is there the little lip on the end of the feed exit chute there?
Here?
Yes.
That little lip was an addition to deflect the links up so they didn't interfere with the ejected cases coming out. That was a problem we ran into that was one of these things that only happened about once every 100 rounds. There might be a hit or a near hit, cause some problems, and this deflects it just enough to where the problem doesn't exist anymore. One of those worrisome little things that you run into on any design.
How do you discover problems like that?
Shooting lots of ammunition. One of the advantages of developing a weapon like this is that the ammunition is so available and inexpensive that you can really afford to fire a lot and learn a lot in a hurry. This is considerably different than, for instance, when we were doing the development work on a 35 millimeter gun that incidentally fired at the same rate of fire as this gun, except that the rounds of ammunition cost us nominally $75 to $80 a piece. So at 550 rounds or 600 rounds a minute, you were using quite a few dollars up. And therefore we had to devise all kinds of schemes with in lieu of firing, because it was just prohibitive in cost to do as much as you might like.
Is that one of the reasons with the bigger guns you get into more computer simulation and analysis?
Oh, that's correct, yes. You're almost driven to it because of the cost of ammunition.
Could you, while we're waiting, show us how that comes apart?
Certainly. One of the first things I might show is that on the barrel change, push down on this latch, and pull the barrel out. It's not very difficult. And then continue on to the field stripping. If you want to take the buttstock off, you just push this latch here and the whole buttstock assembly comes off. And in some cases, in some rolls, they actually can use the weapon without the buttstock on it, or they're going to use it like a submachine gun or whatever. Then continuing on down on the takedown, I'll let this bolt down. This is your trigger group, includes the sear and the safety, and that's about all there is in that. This is the M60 driving spring I was telling you about. It slips out like so. That's the bolt group. Take the feed cover and the feed group off by pulling that pin out. And we're down pretty much the basic receiver thing. This is about as far as anybody would ever field strip it. And then if you really want to get down a little bit further into the bolt group itself, just depress this one little retainer there, pull the cam pin out and the bolt out, and that's as far as we go on the complete field strip.
Now, which of these parts are essentially made with the computer numerically controlled machinery?
Well, basically the receiver, which is the most, the most complex part, is done in the NC machines, and this part, this housing here, which is aluminum, is all machined out with the NC machine. Bolt carrier, which is probably the next most complex part, is done the same way. And the other parts are basically castings that require, like so, require very little machining on them. They're basically cast to shape and then maybe holes reamed out or whatever. This happens to be, this housing here, this feed cover is a NC part also.
And you said there are some cam cuts in here that would have been difficult to do. Is it this weapon that has some cam cuts that would be difficult to do by older machining techniques? But
stand by one. The answer is no.
Hmm?
No.
No?
Not on this machine.
Not
No.
on this one?
No.
All right. Why don't we, as you reassemble this, you could maybe,
Go through some of these other things. I'll go ahead and put this thing back together then. And one of the tricks of designing these things too is to make it impossible that you can reverse assemble anything, and that sometimes is a real trick because GIs are normally very ingenious, and if anything can be put together backwards or wrong, they can do it. So there's a lot into the design consideration to take care of something like that.
in terms of development time, what do you say when you can take a part from an existing weapon like that drive spring and not have to do all the analysis and everything, but just adapt it to a new design?
Well, it depends on the circumstance, but it could save an awful lot of testing. You already know that if this spring was picked because of the cyclic rate was almost identical, the forces you need were identical. So it could save you, a lot of time and money in the development cycle by doing that. Put this barrel back in here. Now we have we took the feed cover off, so how easy that came off. So all we have to do to convert this to the magazine feed is pull the feed pawl off. And this little adapter goes into the same recess. And then you take the M16 magazine, and now the weapon's ready to fire with a magazine. And it's, as you can see, it's slightly offset so that it doesn't interfere with the line of sight.
Okay, you just want to let it sit there for a second, and we'll do another take. Okay. Okay.
That some of the people are doing now, SEALs don't want a bipod. They don't want to carry it around. Okay, it's just, it's just too much of a hassle, and it weighs a lot. So they say they can shoot it right off of that. So they actually say that's not too bad. Use it as a mount.
Ingenious devils, aren't
Yeah.
they? Okay.
They don't like this bipod at all, folding forward. They think it's going to pick up grass and things, and if they order a bipod, they want a special one made that they can fold back. And well, that's the reason I did it this way to begin with. I knew that whoever you sold it to would have a different idea anyway of what that accessory item might want to be.
Whether it is or not, the customer's always right.
Absolutely. Incidentally, on this little magazine adapter, we use the same latch and everything as on the M16. Might as well. And all those parts are available. I'll switch this thing back over to the regular belt feed again. You can see how complicated it really is.
How much time did it take from when you first said how to sit down and draw up something to when you actually had a firing prototype?
Well, there were two people working on the program, myself and the machinist. And we used one of our little skunk works in Florida, and there were just the two of us working on it. And it took it was almost like having a baby, probably close to 9 months before, maybe 6 months to 9 months before we were shooting the first prototype.
That's pretty quick.
But the way I do things, I make my layouts, and then I make what I call more or less shop sketches. They're not really formal prints. Some of the parts you may call that, some of the more complicated parts, but then when I get into little bits and pieces like pins and things like that, sometimes I just make up like a freehand sketch and hand them to the fellow. And the person I have in the shop down there is an excellent machinist, and he knows what I'm expecting. If I forget something, well, he doesn't, so it really speeds up the process. There aren't any checkers involved or no one looking at format or anything like that. And if I make a mistake and the machinist doesn't catch it, well, we have to do it over again. But we're only talking about one prototype. So it does save a lot of time.
How does that compare with working for the government on an RFP where they are asking you to design a weapon?
Well, in some cases with well, for instance, on the 75 millimeter gun that we did, it's just unbelievable the amount of paperwork in order to comply with the contract. Even while we're working on prototypes, they want us to maintain a configuration management control on the thing. So we have to hire people that do nothing but shuffle the paperwork on the configuration of a weapon that isn't even developed yet. And to me, that's ridiculous, really. It just costs a lot of money, and it doesn't have any practical value whatsoever until you're further down the line and you've got a design that you really want to protect because of the amount of testing you put in it. You don't want anybody to inadvertently change anything that could affect the function or the safety. But when you're going through just the initial prototype controls, there's no need to do all those things. But yet our contracts and everything are so complex and so large in scope to try to anticipate everything that could go wrong that we have to, you have to do these things. You have to comply with them. Otherwise, you're not in compliance with the contract. And the other thing a contractor does is that, well, you might not want to do it, but on the other hand, it's an allowable cost, and if you don't do it, you're going to get criticized. So the easiest thing to do is just go ahead and do it. But I can safely say that you can double the amount of paperwork and not contribute anything to the product, at least that's my estimation, on initial prototyping. So it works, and it's got a good place when you get down the line, you get into production or semi-production, where you start to freeze a design in the tech data package. Then all these things should come into play.
What impact does all that paperwork have on creativity? Actually tinkering with a design as you're trying to...
Yeah, it creates a lot of problems because, if you run everything by the book and according to your contract, it means that if you get an idea, and it may be a very good idea that you want to change it, before you can do anything, you've got to go back through and make sure that all the paper is in order, that it can be done, and record it properly and the whole thing. So there's a good place for it, but not, I think, in the initial process.
The process you describe of working with a machinist and doing shop sketches is very similar to what I've heard described for both John Browning and John Guerin. That it's sort of a cut and try type of environment, not crude cut and try, but you're sort of learning as you're going.
Mm-hmm. True. When you're working on original designs, it's the actual piece of the part that you're designing or a gun. I don't care how good you are on the drawing board and visualization, when you actually get the part in hand and look at it, or you watch it going through the shop and the machining processes, it's, I'd say, almost 100% chance that you'll be able to make that part better the second go around or easier to machine by just being there and seeing it. That's the reason I think in the prototyping or any of this type of work, the engineers and all should have an interest in what's going on in the shop. One of the biggest problems you have is a lot of engineers don't want to be even seen in a shop. They think it's beneath their dignity or whatever. But by doing that, you actually can end up with better parts, easier to make, and therefore they're going to be more consistent. So I don't want anything like in small arms like this, where like we were talking about, the ammunition is relatively inexpensive and all. I like to get something in hardware soon, because my experience has been you're going to change it anyway. And I've seldom, if ever, seen where you didn't go through at least 3 iterations in prototyping before you got up into something that you say, this looks like it should be now production engineered and ready to go into production. I've seen this where people put a tremendous engineering effort into a program to try to shortcut that, and I haven't seen it successful yet. And the fact is, if you can do it in 3 iterations, you're doing extremely well. This weapon is our first, to give you an example, this is our first pre-production run. It represents about one of the first 25. We built 2 prototypes that were a little bit different than this to get to this point. And we've shown it around to a few of the users. And since we've put these first 25 together, we've fired probably 100,000 rounds or so of ammunition. And before we'd go in production, I can guarantee you there'd be some changes made in this thing, because we've already recognized production problems. We've also recognized some gripes from would-be users, and they're fairly easy to fix, and they will be. In other words, but you can spend your lifetime on a drawing board trying to anticipate all this, but I don't think it's the quick and cheap way to do it. You can engineer it to death, and still, when you build the hardware, you're going to see things you should have done.
I hear you saying things which reflect your experience in the shop and as a production engineer in your early career, in the sense of you have a familiarity with that environment. But it seems, as you say, one of the problems is that many current engineers maybe are intimidated by that shop environment.
I think they are. I don't think they understand it that well, and to me, like I said earlier, that I think one of the biggest assets I had was the fact that I had to work in the shop for a few years. And I think that that gives you a tremendous advantage as a designer, because you can design things, you know how it's going to be produced and whether it is producible. And I think that one of the biggest criticisms I have for engineering training in this country and schooling is the fact that they don't really require any shop experience. In Europe, they still do. In other words, mechanical engineers still have to go out and act as kind of an apprentice to some of these large companies and perform before they can go back and finish up their schooling. And you work with any of these people, and you see that advantage, that it does do them a lot of good, but we don't in this country.
You mentioned in passing, and I'd like to take you back to it, the issue of safety. It seems to me that one of the areas that the red tape has really grown in the last few years in the area of safety certification of weapons. Originally it started with large caliber, high explosive firing weapons, but now it's worked its way all the way down into rifles and machine guns. What impact has that had on doing business?
Well, I think that the safety in itself, making a weapon that's safe to use, that's not only the fact that you're trying to be safe as far as it blowing up and hurting somebody that way, but also safe in the fact that you can't assemble it in such a way that a non-skilled person could hurt themselves by inadvertently putting it together wrong. I think those are all things that we've always observed, and that really hasn't played a major part in changing gun design necessarily. All good weapons, practically in history, have been fairly safe weapons. Very hard to fire them inadvertently or assembled in a way that they can hurt the operator. I think in the last few years, the biggest problem we have safety-wise are the product liability lawsuits, where people deliberately hurt themselves or somebody else with a weapon and then get themselves a good lawyer and try to collect a lot of money and try to prove that it really was the weapon and not the individual. And that's the thing that I think everybody in the business has more fear of today than anything else. We're not really doing anything much different than we've always done. But we certainly all know what product liability means. That's not just a buzzword anymore. That's the facts of life. And it does mean that you probably spend a lot more time trying to address these things in safety certification. But from a practical standpoint, I can't see that someone is designing anything any different than they ever did. It was always a number one consideration. But I think maybe you document yourself better and cover yourself maybe better than you did before, because mainly of the lawsuit aspects.
But certainly, when you take a weapon onto a U.S. government range now for testing, it has to go through a very elaborate safety certification process. That's added significantly to both cost and paperwork as well, hasn't it?
I think somewhat. The small arms usually are not much different now in safety certification probably than they were years and years ago. It's always been a big issue in artillery type weapons where the consequences can be pretty bad, but in small arms it's probably isn't any more testing and firing done than they used to, but like I say, there's probably a lot more documentation involved.
Want to stop there for a while?
I'm going to just ask a question because you've used the term over and over and over. I mean, I know the answer, but I don't really know how you define your user.
User? Well, in the case of military weapons, of course, it'd be the GI that was firing the weapon. He's the one that's using it. I guess that's the easiest description. I don't know what else. And if
it's one of the pieces of military jargon.
I know that, but I mean, do you have, in designing and all, how much consideration do you have to give that user, and what can you presume about the user?
Well, that's a good one, all right, to try to answer. The user, as a rule, is a person that you, as a designer, you have to have a lot of respect for, and the only way that you can get a lot of respect for the user, both good and bad, is to be in on a lot of user or troop type testing. In other words, I don't consider the user a Aberdeen type specialist in small arms, for instance. It's when you get down and they say you take 20 new rifles down to Benning and they line up some troops and say, you and you and you, this is yours, now go out and shoot it. And you take care of it and maintain it. And there you find out things that you never dreamed could happen to your weapon, as far as the abuse that they get or the lack of care or consideration or whatever. And I think we talked about some other things where in some of these test environments, people deliberately try to foul the weapons up so they don't have to work so hard. But this usually changes in a combat situation, but sometimes it doesn't. There are a lot of cases, I think, documented in Vietnam where the weapons were found that were being carried around every day, and you couldn't even see through the barrels. They were completely rusted out, and the guy just hadn't even bothered about cleaning it. He had other things he was worrying about. But one of the things in the user that you have to worry about is this inadvertent assembly problems, and whether he can break apart easily by taking it apart or losing it. Some of the subtle things there, I didn't go into all these things in this bolt group, but for instance, there aren't any pins or anything to lose in that. Small parts, like in the M16, I learned that firing pin, retaining pin was the first thing that was lost. First field trip, they'd lose this little pin, and away it would go, and the weapon was useless. I ran into that incident one time just when I was over in a test in Southeast Asia, and I ran into this Green Jacket regiment for the British that were going down to have a little fight with the Indonesians in New Guinea, and they'd been issued M16s. And the regimental commander, after I was introduced around, he said, "Could you help me?" And I says, "What?" He said, "Well, he says, about a fourth of our rifles are useless because we've lost that bloody pin." And he said, "I don't know what to do." He says, "I've tried to get new ones, but he says, going through the normal supply channels, he says, we're going to be in combat and home before these things ever caught up." And so I called up somebody at Colt, and about 2 days later, he had an envelope full of about 100 of these things and was on his way. But that's just a typical little thing when it happens once to you and you see that happen, and you try to, in the next design, eliminate that possibility. And that goes on and on through the whole system.
I've heard the term used that you have to Murphy-proof a weapon. In the sense you have to assume that the person using it will do dumb things, pull out pins that he shouldn't, and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. They do, and they also force parts. If they look like they can go together and really can't, I've seen them actually bend and break parts trying to put them together that way. In other words, just, if it doesn't quite go in, we'll get a bigger hammer until it does.
What I've marveled about modern small arms is they are, in a sense, in many ways, like a Chinese puzzle. They go together in a very intriguing but logical way.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen a change in the American user at all with sort of the lack of familiarity with weapons of the sort of newer generation of troops that have come into the field, or you perceive that as an issue?
I don't think it's changed much. Some of our older weapons were much more complicated to field strip and so forth, like the older Browning machine guns, the BAR rifle and all that. Went through a couple of wars, and it was a very difficult weapon for a man to learn. But we got by. And I think, if anything, the weapons now are usually judged somewhat in their capability by how easy they are to field strip, how long it takes, and how many tools do you have to have, because you're never going to have the right tools at the right place.
I noticed that you have been using the bullet. You finished? Okay.
Yeah.